Hello, this is the Mirror Moves. The story today is just like this. My front door didn't just open, it detonated inward like it owed someone money. No knock, no hello, just a sharp blast of cold lake air and the human embodiment of a car alarm barging into my cabin, as if she held the deed in her perfectly manicured claws. Karen, and not just any Karen, our HOA Karen. The same one who'd been patrolling the neighborhood for months, clipboard in one hand, threats in the other, terrorizing anyone who dared to own a lawn chair that didn't meet her aesthetic standards. And here she was mid-meltdown, shrieking about emergency violations so loudly you'd think my porch light was leaking radiation. But here's the plot twist. She wasn't just interrupting a lazy afternoon. She had just crashed the most important meeting of my life. And, by the way, the most dangerous meeting of hers. Because sitting at my table, coffee still steaming, was the state attorney general. Yeah, that attorney general. The one she'd probably hoped would never learn her name. Her timing? Impeccable. If your goal is self-destruction. See, I'm not some special forces guy who came back from Afghanistan with a chip on his shoulder and a taste for vengeance. I'm just a regular guy who's had to watch enough chaos overseas to recognize a bad situation the moment it kicks in the door. I'd been laying low, trying to enjoy the quiet of my lake cabin, the view, the still water, the occasional loon calling in the distance. But quiet doesn't last long when you have a Karen running the HOA like it's her personal dictatorship. And this wasn't some oops, wrong house kind of intrusion. She knew I had company today. She knew it was important. And she still decided she was the main character of the afternoon. The look on her face when she realized who was sitting across from me? Priceless. Her pupils dilated, her mouth opened just enough to start forming an excuse, and her posture shifted from attack dog to cornered squirrel in under 3 seconds. Little did she know, this was the day her entire empire of intimidation was about to start crumbling. To really understand why this moment felt so sweet, you have to rewind a few months back when I first moved into the cabin. It wasn't anything fancy. Just a little lake getaway where the mornings smelled like pine, the evenings hummed with crickets, and the loudest drama was usually a loon fight over fishing rights. Then Karen happened. She introduced herself on my first weekend here. And by introduced, I mean she marched up to my porch, squinted in my mailbox like it had committed a crime, and demanded to know if I'd read the HOA handbook cover to cover. I told her I hadn't gotten a copy yet. She looked at me like I'd just confessed to running an underground gambling ring. From that moment on, I was on her radar. It started small. A warning about my boat cover not matching the approved neighborhood color palette. Apparently beige wasn't lake appropriate. A note about my grass length, which, mind you, was barely taller than a pair of flip-flops. One morning, I caught her with a tape measure on my dock, muttering to herself about non-compliant angles. And it wasn't just me. Everyone in the neighborhood had a Karen story. My next-door neighbor, Jim, once got a violation notice because his inflatable flamingo posed a hazard to waterfowl. Another family got fined for having too many wind chimes. Apparently, there's a decibel limit on joy. The thing about Karen was she wasn't just enforcing rules, she was inventing them. And she had a way of making you feel like questioning her authority was a crime punishable by public shaming at the next HOA meeting. But here's the part she didn't know. I was documenting everything. Every bizarre rule. Every fake violation. Every moment she crossed that blurry line between community oversight and tiny tyrant with a pen. I started keeping a folder, digital and physical, with photos, timestamps, and copies of every letter she sent. What began as a survival tactic slowly turned into a case file. And with every neighbor I talked to, the file got thicker. It was obvious she suspected I was up to something. I could feel her watching from her kitchen window when I loaded my truck. She'd coincidentally stroll by when I had guests over, clipboard in hand, pretending to inspect the curb. Once, she even tried to corner me at the mailbox, fishing for details about my big city contacts. She didn't know the half of it, because this wasn't just about me. This was about every neighbor who'd been bullied into silence. And the day she barged into my cabin, she didn't just interrupt a meeting. She stepped straight into the trap she'd been helping me build for months. The day of the meeting had been planned with military precision. Not because I'm paranoid. Okay, maybe a little. But when you're meeting the state attorney general to discuss HOA corruption, you don't just scribble in your calendar and hope Karen's too busy measuring someone's gutters to notice. We'd chosen my cabin for a reason, quiet, out of the way, and not the kind of place where a nosy HOA president would normally stroll in without an invitation. Except, of course, for this HOA president. I'd made coffee, laid out the documents in neat stacks, double-checked the file on my laptop. Everything was ready. The attorney general, sharp suit, calm eyes, that kind of presence that makes liars sweat, sat across from me, flipping through a stack of photos I'd taken. Pictures of Karen harassing neighbors, copies of bogus violation letters, even a few audio clips of her making threats thinly disguised as community reminders. We were midway through discussing the evidence when, boom, the door slammed open and in came the storm. Karen didn't just enter. She commanded the room like she was a reality TV villain making her big entrance. She had a manila folder clutched in her hand like it was a weapon. And her first words were, "We have a situation, and it needs to be addressed immediately." The audacity. This woman was so convinced of her own authority that she thought barging into my home, in the middle of a private meeting, was her right. Then came the moment. She finally looked up from her folder, ready to lay down the law, and saw him. The recognition was instant. Her eyes widened, her jaw dropped just enough for me to see the tiniest tremble in her lip. She knew exactly who was sitting at my table, and from that second on, the oxygen seemed to leave the room, but only for her. The attorney general didn't even flinch. He looked at her like she was an item on his to-do list and said, in the calmest voice possible, "Why don't you take a seat, Ms.?" A pause, just long enough to twist a knife. "President of the Homeowners Association, isn't it?" Karen's bravado deflated like a pool float in November. She stammered something about urgent community safety concerns and protocols being violated, but the AG leaned back, hands folded, and invited her to explain exactly what she meant. You could almost hear the gears grinding in her head as she tried to reframe her intrusion as noble, not nosy. But the more she talked, the deeper she dug herself in. She contradicted herself twice. Tried to pin things on anonymous neighbor complaints that we both knew didn't exist. At one point, she even claimed she didn't know this was a private meeting. A bold move, considering she'd just admitted she heard through the grapevine I was meeting someone important. Every word out of her mouth was another nail in her own coffin. And I'll admit, I enjoyed watching the shift. The same woman who had once made grown men apologize for the shade angle of their patio umbrellas was now sweating bullets in my dining room. What she didn't realize yet was that this wasn't just going to be an uncomfortable afternoon for her. This was the beginning of the end. The attorney general didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every time Karen tried to twist the story, he calmly brought it back to specifics, dates, times, witnesses. His pen moved slowly across his notepad, each stroke making her shift in her chair like she was sitting on hot coals. Finally, he closed the folder in front of him and said the words I'd been waiting to hear for months. "Ms. Karen, based on what I've just heard and the documentation Mr. Daniels has provided, I'll be issuing an immediate review of your association's conduct. This will include financial records, enforcement actions, and member complaints." Translation: your reign is over. The silence in the room was so thick you could hear the lake waves outside. Karen opened her mouth to argue but stopped. For the first time, she realized there was no audience she could bully, no neighbor she could intimidate into agreeing. This was higher ground, and she wasn't standing on it. The attorney general stood, shook my hand, and left with my evidence. No big dramatic exit, just the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing the next move is already in motion. Karen, on the other hand, lingered. She muttered something about misunderstandings and community spirit before retreating like a cat caught knocking over a vase. Word spread faster than a gossip chain at a HOA barbecue. By the next week, neighbors were whispering about state investigators showing up at the HOA office. 2 weeks later, Karen's position as president was temporarily suspended pending review. Her replacement? A soft-spoken retired teacher who cared more about keeping the park clean than the approved color of someone's deck chairs. The first weekend after she was gone, I sat on my dock with a coffee, listening to the gentle slap of the water against the shore. No more early morning compliance checks. No more threatening letters for owning a non-regulation bird feeder. Just peace. I won't lie. I indulged in a little daydream. I imagined Karen sitting at home, staring at a wall covered in sticky notes labeled "My Rules," while the rest of us were out enjoying a neighborhood free from rain. Justice doesn't always come fast, but when it comes, and when it's thorough, it's better than you can imagine. And as the sun set over the lake, I thought about the file folder now sitting in a government office somewhere, thick with proof, ready to make sure no one like Karen ever got this kind of power again. Sometimes, the mirror doesn't just reflect, it exposes. And that day, Karen finally saw herself for what she was. And now, click subscribe to The Mirror Moves for more entitled people stories. See you next time.